Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle, and today we're going to be talking about something that I'm strangely knowledgeable about. Like, not just in the sense that, okay, I went and I did my research for this and maybe knew a little bit about, but actually, this is something that I have written quite a lot about throughout my schooling, and, well, you see, starting in college and throughout graduate school, I spent a lot of time doing research, reading, and writing about Russia and the Soviet Union. As such, you might imagine I know a thing about Russia and the places that at one point, make up Russia, or made up Russia. And that would be true, or at least I like to think it is. But anyhow, Russia is a really big place, and it has existed in one form or another for a pretty damn long time. As such, there are lots of things that are really easy to miss or just not know about. But today's topic is one that I kind of accidentally stumbled upon and have made somewhat of a cornerstone of my Russian history education. And that topic today would be the history of Finland. Yep, you heard that right. Finland. You may or may not know this, but Finland was once part of Russia for a little more than 100 years. And its history as a part of the Russian Empire and then an independent nation in the sphere of influence of the USSR is a really interesting story. And it's one that seemingly not a lot of people talk about, particularly here in the West. And that's because, well, why would you? It's Finland. Nothing really interesting happens there. Well, I'm here today to tell you that that is not quite the case. Because today, we're going to be talking about the history of Finland in relation to Russia. And what's particularly interesting to me on this is, like I said, I've done a decent bit of reading and researching and writing on Russia, and, well, Finland has been somewhat of a cornerstone of the research and writing that I've done on Russian history for college. In fact, I wrote 2 essays on Finland and its relationship to the Soviet Union, one of which was my undergraduate capstone paper. Which kind of a really sad note about that is, for doing this episode here, I was going to use my research that I'd done previously for the basis of this. And by and large, I did, and a lot of the information that I remembered, and then went and corroborated in other places. But originally, I was basically just going to kind of pull stuff from my previous essays because, you know what, I can plagiarize myself. Ha! Because plagiarizing yourself is dumb. But anyways, I digress. So I wanted to use this old capstone paper, and I thought I had it saved on my computer, and I found the file that it was in. So I pulled it aside, I opened it up, and lo and behold, yeah, of the 20 pages that I wrote, I only had a page and a half left, so oops. Anyhow, enough about me. Let's talk about Finland. And well, now that we're talking about Finland, I gotta do a little side note. Since we're only going to be going over Finland's history in relation to Russia, we are not going to be discussing all of Finnish history. At the end of the day, this is not a Finnish history podcast. It is a Russian history podcast. So, if you want a full recounting of Finnish history, you ain't gonna find it here. And part of the reason that I want to bring this up is that, one, we are not going to start at the kind of extended period of Finland's history. Finland existed before it was part of Russia, and also, we are not going to be talking about the things going on in Finland's kind of internal politics that existed while it was part of Russia or while it was an independent nation, unless they have something to do with Russia, the Soviet Union, Russian society, whatever. So if any Finnish people or really interested in Finland people are listening, yes, I am aware that I'm going to be skipping a lot of stuff and maybe not going super deep into certain other things. Yes, I'm sorry. So, what you will find here is a story that begins in the year 1809. In 1809, the Kingdom of Sweden lost a war, the Finnish War to be precise, also known as the Russo-Swedish War of 1808 to 1809, but I like the Finnish War better. This war marks yet another one of those really exciting and under-discussed wars between the Kingdom of Sweden and the Russian Empire for control of Northern Europe and the Baltic coast. But for today's story, what this war marks was the transfer of Finland from the Kingdom of Sweden into the control of the Russian Empire. In 1809, Sweden signed the Treaty of Hamina, also known as the Treaty of Frederikshamn, which is what I'm going to call it, which gave the Russian government total control of the Finnish territory. But an interesting note here is that Article 4 of the treaty laid out a special provision for the Russian rule of Finnish lands and its people. In the treaty, Tsar Alexander I agreed to make Finland an autonomous Grand Duchy, as it had been in the Kingdom of Sweden. Alexander also agreed to respect and uphold the laws, privileges, and constitution of Finland, and, well, the kind of laws and privileges that they had in the Kingdom of Sweden. And specifically, agreed to not conscript Finns into the Russian military, and allowed the Finns to have their own Finnish military. Though, while this treaty was being hashed out, the war was still on. The Finns were fighting the Russians who were trying to occupy Finland, as the Finns were not exactly excited to be part of the Russian Empire. You see, Finland had been with Sweden for a few hundred years at this point, and had been on the front line of the rivalry between Sweden and Russia. As such, the Finns were absolutely not big fans of the Russians, and to be fair, the Russians felt much the same way. Things really boiled to a head as the Russian forces tried to force Finnish locals to take oaths of allegiance to the Tsar. When Russian soldiers would arrive, the Finns would often flee into the woods, and the Russians would find villages completely deserted. And if they did find people in the villages, the Russians would often employ violence to coerce the Finns into signing. As you might imagine, this didn't really make the Finns any more excited to, stop shooting at the Russians and join up and swear allegiance to the Tsar. So, yeah, by the end of the day, things were not really getting much better, but there was one kind of key piece of this puzzle, and that would be the Finnish upper crust. Because while the local kind of Finnish peasants who were being oppressed by the Russian government and the Russian military were not keen on going with the Russians because of, all the violence that was being committed against them, the Finnish upper crust realized that, hey, we're getting a pretty sweet deal here with Russia and this whole kind of, we get to be our own Grand Duchy and have our own laws and blah, blah, blah. We could actually stand to do quite a bit for ourselves. So they started kind of, getting down with what the Russians were putting out. Though this was not popular with the rank and file average Finn. They were not thrilled, but ultimately they did follow the lead of the gentry, even if they weren't exactly excited about it. But at the end of the day, and this is kind of interesting for the Russian Empire because you don't really hear about this happening a lot, but this really kind of worked out okay for the Finns and for the Russians. For the Russians, they got a pretty damn large chunk of territory, all of Finland, that cemented their control in the Baltic. And for the Finns, they mostly just got left alone and were able to do as they saw fit. They kept their constitution, were allowed to have their own military formations, and continue to follow their traditional culture, speak Finnish, and practice their religion with little interference from the Russian government. Though, key point here, there will be interference, and really kind of plenty of it. When I say little interference, I mean kind of on the scale of the Russian Empire. So what I mean is the Russian government will come in and fuck with them, but they're not going to send troops to have them shot for speaking Finnish. But we will get to kind of what happens there in a second. Anyhow, together, Russia and Finland saw pretty good, roughly 90-ish years of prosperity. Though this is not to say that the Russians were totally absent from Finland. No way in hell. While Finland was technically supposed to be more or less governing itself, it was still part of the Russian Empire, and the Russian Emperor, the Tsar, was still the absolute authority in the region. What this means is that Finland did have its own parliament, the Porvoo Diet, I think I'm saying that right, that was supposed to oversee the laws and whatnot of Finland. But the Porvoo Diet served at the pleasure of the Tsar, who could call and disband the Diet as he saw fit. As such, the Porvoo Diet would not even meet until 1863, a whole 54 years after Finland became a part of Russia, and was, at least on paper anyways, given its autonomy. Until 1863, Finland was governed by a Tsar-appointed governor-general, much the way that basically any other part of the Russian Empire would be. But even with the pretty serious violation of the Finnish autonomy that this really entailed, the Finns were, broadly speaking, kind of okay, and the 1800s were, broadly speaking, a time of peace and prosperity for Finland and the Finnish people. For once ever, the office of the Tsar kinda, sorta, maybe just a smidge, kinda stood by what it was supposed to do. Well, like I said, sort of. One of the areas where Russia really did kinda keep its word was that of the military. Finland was allowed to have its own military formations and was not dragged into Russia's wars, broadly speaking anyways. Other than the Crimean War, Finland stayed out of Russian conflict and was not forced to send its soldiers off to far-off lands to die for the Russian Emperor. And the only reason Finland got sucked into the Crimean War anyways was because an Anglo-French fleet bombarded Finland as part of their campaign against Russia. Outside of politics, Finland and Russia did have some, let's call it, cultural problems. The problem at hand was that the Russians weren't really keen on respecting the Finnish language or Finnish culture. Oh, shit. Another point of the treaty down. Oops. In particular, Russia was interested in keeping Russians on top of the hierarchy all over the empire. To do this in Finland, the Russian government passed the Finnish Language Ordinance of 1850. This ordinance forbade the publication of most books outside of religious ones in the Finnish language. So, if you want to stay up to date on literature, culture, economics, whatever, I guess you're reading it in Russian? Or maybe in Swedish. This gave the Russians an upper hand in the region for pretty obvious reasons, and forced the Finnish upper class to have to learn Russian if they wanted to be part of the kind of broader Russian imperial high society, or they would have to learn Swedish because that was the kind of common language of the Finnish upper class. This law helped create separation and resentment between the Russianized Finnish gentry and the more traditional Finnish peasantry. It also helped cement Russians as the ruling class above everyone. And to make matters worse, as I was saying before, Swedish was the traditional language of government, literature, and education in Finland. And now, Russian had been introduced as a language of power and influence on top of the pre-existing Swedish-dominated structure, which had already displaced Finnish in all the halls of power, education, and literature. This denigrated Finnish to basically only the language of the peasantry, while keeping the Finnish elite more focused on Swedish, which they could still publish in, or Russian, which was not strictly an official language of Finland, but kind of was one just because of the fact of Finland being a part of the Russian Empire and having a Russian-speaking bureaucracy in charge of Finland for most of its time in the Russian Empire. But not only did the Finnish Language Ordinance enforce class distinctions and enshrine Russian dominance, it also served to silence Finnishness in all aspects of not only high society, but really in everything all across the country, at least as far as kind of large-scale culture and literature would go. As without Finnish language education and Finnish language literature, the Finnish cultural identity would certainly suffer and be more susceptible to being overpowered by the Russian language and Russian literature and Russian cultural expression. So yeah, this is pretty not cool. This is an interesting time because, broadly speaking, Finland is being left alone more than basically anyone else in Russia. But as you can see, Finland is still being routinely fucked over by the Russian government, who is still not really following along with their rules as laid out by the Treaty of Fredrikshamn. But, as I said before, things in Finland were, broadly speaking, going well for the Finns, and they were more or less prospering. Again, when I say they were prospering, they were free, things were going well, this is very much so in comparison to the other peoples in other parts of the empire. But this relative prosperity didn't last forever. Things started to change with the end of the 19th century. At this time, we started to see a big upswell in nationalism. This kind of nationalist issue really came to a head when Germany unified in 1871. Russian nationalists saw a unified Germany as a massive threat to Russian culture and Russian dominance in the region. In particular, they feared ethnic Germans, known as Baltic Germans, who held high positions in the Baltic states, places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Being that the Baltic Germans were culturally German speakers within the Russian Empire, the Russians were worried that Germany, the newly made state, might find support with these Baltic Germans and ultimately come to slurp up the Baltic German controlled territories, as Germany had done with the German speaking peoples of Austria, France, and Denmark not that many years ago. In order to solidify their hold on the Baltics, many within the Russian government wanted to see the government take a more direct approach to Russianizing Finland and to bring Finland under direct control of the Tsar, as opposed to letting it kind of, do what it had been and being autonomous. At the same time, Finland was going through a nationalist phase itself. While the Tsar had banned the publication of Finnish literature, they didn't stop the Finns from doing that. As well, Finns interested in protecting their cultural roots in the Finnish language started creating Finnish grammar schools to boost Finnish literacy and the Finnish identity. So, on the one hand, you have the Russians who are going, we want to Russianize the Finns, but at the same time, the Finns who are saying, we want literally anything other than that. They're going through this cultural kind of awakening at the same time that the Russians are doing their big cultural crackdown. As you might imagine, well, nothing good really comes for that for the people of Finland. Despite the fact that he was a major asshole who was a Russian nationalist, the Tsar, Alexander III, who was in charge during this time of heightened Russian nationalism, kind of, 1880s, opted to not listen to the people in his government and mostly respected Finland's wishes to be left alone. But then, Alexander III died, and with his death came everybody's favorite Romanov, baby. That's right. If you didn't expect to hear about Tsar Nikolai II today, then here you go. Surprise! In 1894, the very last Romanov to ever sit on the imperial throne, well, sat on the throne. And as we have discussed before, if Nikolai was anything, he was a massive pushover, the likes of which you would not believe. And if he was anything else, he was a staunch believer in the Russian autocracy, Russian culture, and the Russian nation. So, as you might imagine, Russia's most powerful spineless nationalist asshole was not really one to stand up to the Russian court when you could just, do whatever the hell they wanted. Especially because he was nationalist as hell, they were nationalist as hell, and he honestly probably, was pretty on board with it anyhow. So, Nikolai started trying to force Finland into direct control of the Russian Empire. This started on February 15th, 1899, when Nikolai issued a manifesto that proclaimed that he alone was entitled to enact laws in Finland, and that he could do so without the Porvoo Diet's consent. He then started directly trying to Russianize the Finnish people. In 1900, the Tsar made Russian an official language of Finland, as opposed to before, where it was kind of just not really an official language, but was more or less forced on them through, kind of weird wheelings and dealings. Now it is going to be officially a language of Finland. And in 1901, the Tsar decreed that the Finns would now have to serve in Russian military units of the Russian Imperial Army, and he also ordered that the Finnish military be disbanded. As I've pointed out a few times throughout this episode, the Russian government was not exactly keen on sticking to all of the points of the Treaty of Frederikshamn. The Finnish Diet was hamstrung by the Tsar from day one, and Finnish culture and the Finnish people were always second class in the eyes of the empire. But, by and large, direct action was not taken against the Finnish people or the Finnish government by the Russian Empire. These new changes in 1899, 1900, and 1901 really changed all that. For the first time, the very existence of the Grand Duchy of Finland and the immediate existence of the Finnish language and Finnish culture were under direct, immediate threat. And as such, the Finns reacted as well you might expect. Two camps were quickly set up within Finnish society. On the one hand, you had the nationalists. These people were known as the constitutionalists. Broadly speaking, they demanded that Russia continue to respect the Finnish constitution and treat the Treaty of Frederikshamn with respect. They said that the actions of the Tsar were illegal and in direct violation of what Russia's obligations to Finland were. Obligations that had been respected more or less for over 90 years now. And on the other hand, you had the compliers. Well, their name's the compliers. What do you think they wanted to do? They wanted to concede to the Tsar. Ultimately, the compliers won out, and the constitutionalists were removed from the government, and the leaders of the constitutionalists were exiled from the country. But that is not to say that the constitutionalists had no effect. When the Russian army called up Finnish men to join, enough Finns refused that the Russian government ultimately gave up on trying to draft them. The Finnish army wouldn't exist anymore, but the Finns also would no longer be conscripted into the Russian army, as they were supposed to be for a couple weeks there. While all this nationalist shit was going on, it would be unfair to leave out the Marxists. So, let's talk about the Labour Party. The Labour Party was founded in 1899, and then in 1903 changed its name to the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democrats, as I shall now refer to them as, were equally as not interested in Russian imperial rule and even worked together with the Constitutionalists during the 1905 revolution and joined together in a nationwide general strike, the same one that would ultimately result in the creation of the Duma. As for Finland, the strike forced the Tsar to return Finland back to its pre-1899 status with all of the rights and laws enshrined in the Treaty of Fredrikshamn. But as you might imagine, this would not exactly carry on for all too long. But before the Russian government could crack down on Finland once again, the Social Democrats got yet another win, though this one came from the Finnish government itself. In 1906, the Finnish Diet was overhauled. The old four-chamber Diet was now suddenly a unicameral parliament, and Finland now had universal suffrage. Now with a truly representative parliament and universal suffrage, the political parties of Finland started to form along the Marxist and nationalist lines, as represented by the Social Democrats and the Constitutionalists. But, as I said earlier, the Tsar was not exactly happy about letting Finland, do his whole monocameral, unicameral, I guess is the actual word, unicameral parliament thing, and, just all of that. Instead, the Tsar kept adjourning the Porvoo Diet and calling it back and adjourning it again, so that, nothing could be done. Then in 1910, he transferred the responsibility for all important legislation in Finland from the Porvoo Diet to the State Duma in St. Petersburg, which effectively gutted the Finnish parliament once and for all. But then, World War I happened, and things got a little hugely out of hand for the Russian Empire. During the war, the Finnish liberation movement linked up with the German Empire and struck up a deal. The deal goes as follows. The Finns will go to Germany, get trained and armed, and then go fight for Germany against the Russians. In return, Germany will secure an independent Finnish state. Easy as that. And then that's kind of more or less what happened. Thousands of Finns went to train in Germany and fought against the Russian Empire in order to secure their independence, and then in November of 1917, the new Bolshevik government gave it to them. But now that Finland was free of the Russian Empire, Finland had another conflict brewing. This would be the issue of the Marxists and the nationalists. On January 28th of 1918, the Finnish Red Guards, the Finnish pro-Marxist forces, seized Helsinki and a number of large industrial towns in southern Finland. But the initial successes of the Finnish Reds were quickly overturned by the General Carl Gustav Mannerheim and the Finnish White Army, and some assistance by the German military. I won't get too far into the Finnish Civil War, as it really is outside of the scope of Russian history, but it was a fairly short conflict that brought the Finnish Whites and Germany even closer together, while greatly widening the gap between the now independent nation and the soon-to-be fully established Soviet Union. During the interwar years, Finland watched on as the Soviet Union solidified its power and ultimately started growing in strength and influence, and that growth was pretty damn rapid. This drove Finland towards Germany because they were pretty damn scared of this new, powerful post-Russian Empire successor state. And because before all this, Germany was their closest ally, and they did that whole World War I thing together. But also, Finland started getting close with Sweden. Sweden is kind of interesting because they've always had a pretty decent relationship with Sweden, which carries on to this day. Other than Germany and Sweden, Finland started looking to the other states on the Baltic coast as potential allies. Finland reached out to Poland, Estonia, and Latvia in an attempt to create some kind of defensive bloc against their common threat, a now fully operational Soviet Union. In 1922, Finland attempted to create such a bloc, but the Finnish parliament didn't sign off on it, and ultimately Finland would have to sign a non-aggression pact with the USSR in 1932. As you might imagine, this was not popular, as the Finns recognized that the USSR would absolutely 100% not keep its word on this non-aggression pact. And then, to the horror of all the Finns, but to the surprise of none of them, Russia came back for what they saw as theirs. In 1939, not long after the Soviet Union cooperated with the Nazis to take over Poland, the USSR reached out to Finland and said, "Hey, see that Karelian isthmus right there? Yeah, looks pretty nice, don't it? And well, we know y'all are kind of buddy-buddy with Germany, and sure, we were kind of buddy-buddy with Germany, but now we're not. We're kind of concerned about those guys. So, why don't you just make with the land since it's a little close to St. Petersburg, I mean Leningrad?" And the Finns said, "No, not doing that." Believe it or not, the Finns were not a big fan of the USSR, which they saw as the successor to their most recent imperial rulers, the Russian Empire. They didn't trust the USSR and weren't keen on just, taking their word that, yeah, we'll give you the Karelian Isthmus and everything will be cool. I mean, think about it. What had just happened to them about 20 years ago with Tsar Nikolai II? Sure, this is a new government, a new state, and a new state philosophy, but it's not hard to see that the USSR was kind of working on rebuilding the Russian Empire's territorial claims. So, the Finns told the USSR to pound sand. So, the USSR did what the USSR did best. They invented a pretext for invasion, and then bungled the whole thing. In an interesting case of a real, honest-to-God false flag attack, the Soviet military shelled its own troops near the border of Finland. They said that this shelling was done by the Finns, and then used this as a pretext to void the 1932 non-aggression pact and justify their invasion of Finland. So, the Red Army invaded, and immediately got bogged down by the better organized, better motivated, and better trained Finnish defenders. If this sounds familiar to something that is happening currently, maybe it's a sign of a pattern. But anyhow, I won't go too far into this conflict, what is known as the Winter War, because it was a fairly short affair, only from fall 1939 to spring of 1940, and quite a bit happened during that time, and I don't necessarily want to kind of shoehorn that into today's episode. So I promise you we will go over this at some other time in the future. But for now, the main thing to know is that after a massive expenditure of manpower and machinery, the Soviet Union was able to finally break through the Finnish defenses and were able to, all of a sudden, put a pretty serious threat to the sovereignty of Finland in play because, well, after they broke through that line, there's kind of just Soviet soldiers everywhere. So Finland ultimately would negotiate a peace with the USSR and was forced to hand over a nice little chunk of land. In particular, they had to give over Karelia and some of the land around it. This would create a buffer zone between the rest of Finland and the former capital of the Russian Empire, the city then known as Leningrad. And this gap between Finland and Leningrad, and the city of Leningrad itself, would turn out to be pretty important starting in just about a year after the conclusion of the Winter War. In the spring of 1941, the Finnish government reached out to the Nazi government in Germany and said, "Hey, you don't like the USSR? we don't like the USSR. Maybe there's some kind of deal we can come to here. And Germany was really picking up what Finland was putting down. You see, Germany had this really crazy plan they were about to put into action where they were going to invade the Soviet Union. And well, the Finns were kind of saying that they would totally be into helping Germany do this. And all the Germans would need to do was arm and equip the Finnish military. So, a formal treaty was never made, but German troops were allowed into Finland, and German guns and gear did end up in the hands of Finnish soldiers. And on June 22nd of 1941, when Nazi Germany kicked off Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union, they did so from Finland as well as, of course, across many points on the German and Soviet border, and they did so with the Finnish military marching right beside them. While operating in tandem with the Germans, Finland was technically not a member of the Axis powers, and the conflict that had now started between the USSR and Finland was kinda sorta separate from World War II, but not really. The continuation of the Winter War was known as the Continuation War. Imagine that. This was not really a war at helping the Nazis take over the world, or to conquer the USSR, or to kill the Untermenschen. Instead, this was a pretty cut and dry revenge situation for the Finns. They did not like the USSR, and they wanted to take back what they lost. But to also say that Finland was totally without any kind of complicity is also wrong. Finland did aid the Germans in their deportation and killings of Soviet Jews, and the killing and subjugation of non-Jewish Soviet citizens. In fact, as a show of good faith between Finland and Germany, Finland even created a special task force of policemen and soldiers who were supposed to aid the German Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA. The RSHA being the office of the German police that, broadly speaking, oversaw the mass killing and deportation of Jews in captured territories and deployed the Einsatzgruppen and death squads. The men sent by Finland to the RSHA were formed into their own Einsatzgruppe, Einsatzkommando Finland. As well, outside of the complicity of the Finnish state in the German genocide and war crime machine, Finland did play a larger role in the war than what it may first appear. While the goal of Finland's involvement in the Continuation War was originally to take back the land that they'd lost in 1939 and 1940, the Finnish military would ultimately march into the USSR and take part in the blockade of Leningrad, a city that had been part of the Russian Empire and then Soviet Union for about 240 years at this point. The main reason I want to point out the complicity of Finland is that I have heard some people argue that this war, the Continuation War, was not really about taking land from the Soviets, or not really about getting revenge, or that Finland was not really allied with Germany, or not really complicit in their crimes, and that they just so happened to take advantage of the German invasion to their own invasion. And I say emphatically, that is not true. Finland was complicit in the Nazi war crimes and genocide that occurred in the Soviet Union, as they not only coordinated with the Nazis to conduct the invasion and took German supplies to carry out the fighting, but that the Finnish government went out of its way to send men in order to be directly involved in Germany's genocide via the RSHA. As well, Finland's forces objectively exceeded the territory that had been lost in 1940, and even some within Finland pointed this out at the time and said that the Finnish military should not advance past the previously lost territory. But these pleas fell on deaf ears, as the Finnish military took part, right alongside their German partners, in the deadliest siege in history, the Siege of Leningrad. Again, a city that was not lost in 1940 during the Winter War and had been part of the Russian Empire and then the USSR for roughly 240 years at that point. I want to point this out because to this day, many people are not aware of the role that Finland played in the Second World War. And I want to make this clear that this isn't some kind of Finland hit piece. And I'm not trying to say how much Finland is some evil, shitty country or anything like that. But this is a real part of history, and it needs to be talked about. It should not be forgotten or allowed to be avoided in discussion. So, I just wanted to make sure that we took a second to discuss that. And now back to the kind of major events of the war. The initial successes of Finland and their German partners started to be turned around in 1942 and 1943. After the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army was on the march westward, and there was seemingly very little the Germans could do to stop them. The Finns watched in horror from their positions around Leningrad and at home as many people started to call for peace agreements between Finland and the Soviet Union before the Red Army made it back to Leningrad and came to fuck the Finns up. But the Finns never did create a peace agreement, or well, not before the Soviet Union arrived at their doorstep. This time, there was not going to be an epic stand against the tide of Soviet soldiers. This time, the Soviets would rapidly breach the Finnish border and threaten all of Finland. To stop the invasion and to save Finland, the Finns signed an armistice with the Soviets on September 19, 1944. Not only did this cease hostilities between the Soviet Union and Finland, but it actively forced the Finns to fight against the Nazis, as one of the conditions of the armistice was that no enemy, meaning German, forces were allowed to be inside Finland. So, with no recourse left, Finland signed the armistice, made peace with the USSR, and started up the war against Germany. Once the war was over, Finland was in a very awkward position. Not only had it fought with the Nazis, which made it a bit of a pariah for literally everyone, it had dealt with the Soviet Union directly, and fell pretty squarely into the Soviet sphere of influence. This put Finland in a really bad spot, as it didn't want to piss off anyone, but also needed to take a side in the looming Cold War. They couldn't really throw in with the US, NATO, and the West, because the Soviets had them on a pretty tight leash, especially after 1948. This was because of the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance that Finland and the USSR signed in 1948. This excessively wordily named treaty was basically just an agreement that said that Finland was an independent country, but that it had to kowtow to the USSR. In particular, the agreement forbade Finland from joining any organization considered hostile to the USSR. So, that means no NATO, no Baltic or Nordic defense pacts, no economic or military cooperation with anyone that the USSR is not expressly okay with. So, that means that Finland is going to have to trade pretty much only with the people within the Warsaw Pact. Though to be fair, Finland was a member of the Nordic Council of Ministers, which was a mostly economic, cultural, and scientific organization, so I guess that seems pretty okay to the Soviets, I guess not super threatening. These conditions were pretty harsh change for Finland, who had relied quite a bit on its close relations with Germany and Sweden for military and economic cooperation. And well, not only is all of this going on and there's these pretty harsh stipulations, but shit man, Germany doesn't even really exist anymore. So it's pretty easy to say that Finland is more or less being slurped into the Russian sphere of influence, and there's not a lot that they can do about it. But at the same time, Finland didn't want to be lumped in with the USSR, and they certainly didn't want to get dragged into the Cold War. They wanted to have decent relations with the West and NATO, and to have the trade that would come with it instead of being stuck with the communist USSR and its wacky-ass international economic and financial dealings. But even if Finland was allowed to go out and get involved with the rest of Europe or America or whomever, basically no one was really interested in the late 40s and early 50s because they saw the Finns as collaborators with the Nazis and as Soviet puppets. Though to be fair, the Finns were not Soviet puppets, but they were only just about one step above that. This process of not really puppet but kind of puppet is what is known as Finlandization. Basically, what Finlandization is is that a country is not technically controlled or directly influenced by a larger power, but instead, the threat of economic or military action by the stronger power keeps the weaker power towing the line of said stronger power. As you can see, Finland's position was a bit weird at the time, so odd that someone invented this word that bears Finland's name to describe it. And well, Russia's Finlandization of Finland worked. The Finns stayed neutral in basically everything, and when they did things that the Soviet Union didn't like, all the Soviets had to do was ring them up and say stop it, and well, they would. For example, in 1958, a coalition government was formed that included some anti-Soviet folks. The Soviet Union rang up the leader of that coalition government, Karl Fagerholm, oh my, and told him to, fix that shit. The Finns immediately struck that government and reformed one that the Soviet Union approved of. The Finns sat at the edge of the Soviet power structure until 1991, when the Soviet Union finally breathed its last. But interestingly enough, Finland did not immediately join up with NATO. Instead, they continued their path of neutrality and continued to have pretty decent relations with the newly formed Russian Federation, while also creating closer ties with the rest of Europe, in particular with Sweden. Sweden and Finland have had very close economic and military ties all the way back to the founding of Sweden. Sweden has followed a very similar path of neutrality to Finland, but they did it without falling under Soviet influence. And up until very recently, the two countries have mostly stayed out of the kind of large conflicts of the world and have avoided the burgeoning NATO-Russia tensions of the 21st century. This is until the war in Ukraine that began February 24th, 2022. Tensions had already been high between the Nordic countries and the Russian Federation, and increased Russian posturing and heightened Russian military presence all over the world generated fear in a number of countries that were on the edge of the Russian Federation and its kind of sphere of influence. Although most of these countries were already part of NATO, there was still quite a bit of fear that, Russia might try to, say, interfere with them, or even directly invade. For Finland and Sweden, this was a particularly real threat, as they were not members of NATO. So, if Russia were to invade with them, there was no guarantee that there would be any kind of large-scale military or any other resistance. So, the fear of Russian invasion or heightened Russian influence was very real. When Russia ultimately invaded Ukraine in 2022, it kicked all of these fears into hyper overdrive. All over the world, people were discussing the possibilities of Russia expanding the conflict, and were discussing what Russia's next target might be once it was done in Ukraine. Finland and Sweden, being some of the only non-NATO aligned states in the region, seemed like they were likely targets for any expansion of the war or future Russian aggression. So, on April 4th, 2023, and March 11th, 2024, Finland and Sweden, respectively, joined NATO as the 31st and 32nd members of the treaty organization. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a fairly condensed, and by fairly I mean very condensed, history of Finno-Russian relations and Finnish history as it pertains to Russia. In the future, I 100% want to do an episode about the Winter War and the Continuation War, and some of the specifics of Finland's role in World War II, but that is going to have to be for a later date because, as of now, we are already pushing about 50 minutes on this one, and I don't think that y'all want to sit here for another hour and a half while I talk about, these two wars or any of that other stuff. So, for now, I just want to do a little overview of this history, and in the future, I promise we will come back to it. Also, speaking of brief overviews, I wanted to give you all a brief overview of what's going on with this podcast. I can assure you, it's nothing bad. It is just that it is nearing the end of the year, and I'm a very busy guy at the moment. And I don't think the system I have set up right now is really working for me, you, or anyone. What I'm talking about is that I don't like this every other week shit. I like releasing episodes every week, and I like it when those episodes are long, in-depth, and really informative. And I can tell that you, the listeners, like it that way too. I can see how many people are reacting to things on my metrics through Spotify, and I get more listeners and more engagement, and people seem to like it better when I do weekly posts. But for right now, I'm not able to make those kinds of episodes or keep up with that release schedule because of my non-podcast related schedule. So I'm going to have to take a little break for right now. I'm thinking that I'm going to say that this here is going to be the last episode for a little while, and that I'm going to come back at the beginning of February and start it all up again. But I kind of want to make it clear, I don't really want to take a break, because I really fucking love doing this shit. I'm having a blast, man. This has been great. But I have to do that really shitty thing where I'm an adult and do what's best for myself and for the podcast. So I really do need to take a little break. So consider this basically the end of the first season of the Beneath the Red Star podcast. Though I will have one more episode coming out a week from today on next Wednesday. This episode, though, will be a State of the Podcast episode, and I plan on doing one of these like every year. That way we can have a little discussion. That way we can kind of talk about where the podcast is going, where it is currently, what's going to be happening in the future, stuff like that. And then also that way you can give me some ideas of, hey, I like this, I don't like this, I want to see more of this, less of this, whatever. That whole thing. In particular, this next week kind of State of the Podcast episode will be discussing the break and how this is well going to, ba-doom crash, break down, and how long I intend to be away and what I'm going to be doing while I am away. So please tune into that so that you know, I promise you, I am not just going to pull the plug on this. I will be back in February. But anyhow, this episode marks the end of Season 1 of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, and you bet your ass I will be back and back soon. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you all for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed the show and that you learned something here today. If you did enjoy the show, or even if you didn't, please don't hesitate to leave me a review on whatever platform it is that you listen on, as reviews help me to make the show better, and of course, they make the algorithm happy. And, well, if that's not what life's all about, then I guess I just don't know what is. As well, if you would like to stay up to date with the podcast, you can follow the show at BTRSPod on Instagram to get updates, Russia-related content, and occasional pictures of my cats. But for now, I just want to say thank you all again for listening. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.